Welcome, everyone. My name is Leslie Orloff. I direct NewApp at the American University Washington College of Law, and we facilitate the National Judicial Network that is co-sponsoring this event today. Just before we get started, those of you that are judges or judicial staff and work with judges, I wanted to encourage those of you that are in touch with judges or are judges yourselves to consider joining our National Judicial Network. Participants in the network, so far we have 480 judges from 44 states and U.S. jurisdictions, and it provides an opportunity to request webinars like the one we're going to have today, and also to participate in peer-to-peer sessions where you can have conversation with judges around the country on topics related to victims of human trafficking and immigrant survivors of crime, and the work that courts do on those issues. We also, for those, I know some of you on the call today, on the session today, are law enforcement and prosecutors. After the webinar today, we will also share some links that include roundtables that are available. They're peer-to-peer sessions for law enforcement and prosecutors. And so I encourage you to use the QR code if you're a judge or working for a judge. That will take you to the landing page for the National Judicial Network, which has a description of the network, and it has recordings of past events we've had, but also has a place where judges can register. And it's for judges only. So I will stop there, and I'm very excited today to welcome Catherine Walls, who's going to be joining us and talking about labor trafficking of children. We're very excited to have her here. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Catherine.
Great. Thank you, Leslie. Can everyone see my screen? Great. Okay. Welcome to Child Labor Trafficking in the U.S., an overview of research, law, and policy, opportunities for action, or otherwise known as what you need to know about child labor trafficking in the United States. To start us off, I want to share a little bit of background about how I got into this, but just a fun fact, or maybe actually it's not so fun fact, but that labor trafficking is the most prevalent form of human trafficking in the world. And child trafficking is one of the most underreported types of trafficking in the United States. So I'm very honored and pleased that you all are participating in this webinar and learning more about this. I feel extremely grateful to be able to talk to you about this topic for many reasons, not only because of the kind of gravity and importance of the topic, but also on a personal note. I started working in the field almost 20 years ago as an attorney representing survivors of human trafficking, both children and adults. And when I first started practicing, many of the clients that I saw were, in fact, labor trafficking victims. And I worked at a non-for-profit organization, and I represented individuals in both immigration and legal services and criminal legal services for those who were victims of trafficking, who were also engaged as victim witnesses on the criminal legal side, where there was an active investigation or prosecution against the trafficker. And so my own training on the topic was very much focused on sex trafficking and focused on foreign national survivors. But as I was seeing more cases, the majority of the cases were in fact labor trafficking cases and young people. And so later I recognized that this is not a new crime, that this is a version of an older crime impacting all persons, including US citizens, non-US citizens, adults, and children, but that children and young people were uniquely vulnerable and at risk for this crime. So I've worked in this field for a long time as a practitioner, as a service provider, working in different legal systems, and that work led me to do some policy outreach and training. And I'm currently the director of the Center for the Human Rights of Children at Loyola University Chicago School of Law, which is an interdisciplinary center, and child trafficking is one of our priority areas. So we do, we teach, we publish, we conduct research. I'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation, as well as a number of other activities. But just without further ado, I want to move on. So the goal today is to better understand child labor trafficking, to be better at identifying it and to provide protections to survivors of child labor trafficking. And I just want to note that I use the term survivor and victim interchangeably in my presentations for obvious reasons. Victim is a legalistic term, but we all know that that doesn't define the experience of survivors or those who are impacted by trafficking. I'm going to start us off with exploring the historical antecedents of modern day human trafficking and demonstrate why it's important to better understand and respond to labor trafficking in modern times with this historical context. And then I'll cover the basics of federal laws and policies on child labor trafficking, which I imagine will be familiar ground to many of you, but I want to focus on some key takeaways as to how these laws are applied specifically to children and child labor trafficking survivors. I'll also provide some case examples to demonstrate the diversity of types of cases, which will lead us, which will be a nice natural segue into identification and identification challenges. In part two, we'll shift gears and talking about how we can be better about identifying the cases. And then last year, together with brilliant colleagues at Northeastern and NYU, I had the privilege of publishing the culmination of a 3-year national study, the first of its kind on child trafficking in the United States that was funded by the National Institute of Justice. So I'll share some of the key findings, just some high-level findings, focusing on, I think, what's most relevant for this group. And then I hope to wrap up with a concrete list of action steps so we can all strengthen our own practices in response to these issues. If it's not obvious already, I speak very, very fast, and I often have way too much to share than in the time that I have allotted. So I would love if someone can just ping me when we're like halfway through, just to make sure I'm keeping up with time. And then feel free. Are we leaving questions at the end? I believe we're saving questions for the end. But just let me know if in the interim if I need to pause or stop.
Catherine, however you prefer to handle it, we can
Okay.
do either.
Yeah, if we can just save questions for the end, I think that would be best, and I'll do my best to keep us on track. So, now, before we dive into the content, I thought we'd pause and engage in a brief exercise as to why we're even talking about child trafficking versus adult trafficking. And I know this may seem obvious, but when we dive into the law and the legal elements later in the presentation, this context is going to be important. So if we can all submit responses in the chat, please identify a difference between children and adults. And I'll ask someone, one of my co-organizers, to read off some of the responses. And it can be, as basic as they're smaller than we are. Biological differences, behavioral differences, linguistic differences.
So I'm seeing maturity, ability to consent, brain development, somebody defined as a child, age, legal status.
Oh, that's a
Children
very
are more vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
Need more time for play in order to develop social behaviors.
Yes.
Legal protections.
I really like that that a couple of folks focused on kind of just legal protections may be different as well. So on a fundamental level, you've identified some biological differences. Their anatomy and physiology is different. That means any harm that comes to them, any exposure to toxins, environmental toxins, their environment has disproportionate impact because their brains and bodies are still developing. Their immune systems are not fully developed. Their bones are still growing. Their brains are fully not formed. So that goes back to capacity, right? And capacity to consent, also ability to assess risk. They may perceive situations with more innocence and hope. They may normalize certain situations, including trafficking. This changes through adolescence. They don't process information the way we do. And even when we interview them or screen children or talk to them about their experience, they respond linguistically in different ways to both verbal and nonverbal cues. And so that has a lot of impact in even just interviewing, for example, or potential screening or identification. And so these are all important, and then impact also on their engagement in the legal system and conversations with judges, with attorneys, with case managers. This can be a wholly separate presentation, but I think it's important context when we, again, talk about later when I focus on the legal elements of trafficking and some of the distinctions in their application. So one example is if their bodies are still growing, so how does abuse and trauma impact them differently from adults? How does discrimination and classism impact how we think of certain children? Do we have normative values that may play out in our own individual assessments or systemic assessments about what a child is capable of, how they engage in work, for example, or different types of labor? And I think maybe a more simpler question to ask is, have you ever observed a child being treated like an adult because of social or cultural norms? And that's a really important, if you answered yes, or you think even yes, that's a really important uh, consideration as we talk about identification and the law as we move forward in this presentation. So I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to talk a little bit about history. So there are a lot of legal terms that describe the compelled services or work of a human being for the profit of another, including human trafficking. And the act of slavery, which legalized the ownership of a person's property involving compulsory work, is perhaps the most well-known term, and it's often used to describe trafficking. Some people use the phrase, this is a modern-day form of slavery. And I think it's really important to contextualize our contemporary human trafficking laws, including labor trafficking and forced labor, in this historical context, because I think it elevates the reason why we need to be better about understanding some of the dynamics and how we actually apply the law, and particularly with respect to children and other vulnerable populations. So, it's a known fact that the U.S. has a long and documented history of slavery and human exploitation, which is rooted in colonial times and reinforced through law. But even in early federal laws aimed at limiting slavery, like the Slave Trade Act of 1794 and the Act prohibiting importation of slaves in 1807, and there's a little clip here of that law, they failed in practice. And while they restricted aspects of the slave trade, including the traffic or trade in slaves, they were poorly enforced and had little impact on actually ending this practice. And over time, the US legal system has used many terms to describe slavery and slavery-like practices. And that includes debt bondage, peonage, indentured servitude, all forms of compelled service that benefit others at the expense of a person's freedom. And then the terms here on the slide, which will likely look familiar to those of you who are familiar with contemporary human trafficking laws under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, have been part of our jurisprudence long before the TVPA or the Reauthorization Acts, and really since the foundation of our country. And so the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation outlawed slavery and the ability for a person to legally own another as property. And it also outlawed involuntary servitude, the practice of involuntary servitude, which is the ability for a person to legally own another as property and also to knowingly and willfully hold into involuntary servitude. And the recognition with the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation that involuntary servitude or involuntary slavery is a legal and constitutional term for a person who is laboring against that person's will to benefit another under some form of coercion to which may constitute slavery. This is really important because there's terms here that are open to interpretation, right? What is willfully hold? What is involuntary? What is a form of coercion? And so, over the next 150 years, the definition of what counted as involuntary, we no longer allow, we've outlawed chattel slavery. We understand involuntary servitude consist in practice. So what counts as involuntary was implied inconsistently across decades, across our courts and our jurisprudence for, and I'll repeat it, for approximately 150 years until we get to the TVPA and a seminal Supreme Court case that preceded it. And this is shaped by bias, by discrimination, by cultural norms, by regional differences, and other social factors. And I would argue that these continue today when we think about how we interpret even our own contemporary anti-trafficking laws. And so that's why I'm trying to kind of start this in some historical kind of antecedents of the modern day trafficking laws. And I want to just provide some quick overviews of some historical cases. And even though these happened a long time ago when I'm showing black and white pictures, the facts of these cases are not unlike contemporary trafficking cases, right? But we didn't have a trafficking law during this time. So in this case, US v. Ancarola, the government detained a group of Italian children who had been brought into the country to perform as street musicians. The children were here under the control of an adult, Ancarola, who profited from their labor. The government argued that their migration was a form of involuntary servitude. Again, what is involuntary? Here, the adult claimed the children were his apprentices. They weren't victims of exploitation, but the government saw the arrangement as exploitative. And they cited to the children's poor living conditions, their lack of freedom, that Ancarola himself was profiting wholly from their labor as street performers. And it's one of the earliest US legal efforts to address child exploitation, also in the context of immigration and migration. It was one of the first examples where courts in the United States and immigration authorities use legal mechanisms to challenge coercive legal practices affecting foreign-born children. Right? And so we see cases like this now, whether it's peddling or other types of kind of similar activities. Moving fast forward, I have very little time here, but to go through other cases, and these are all cases that are also cited in the kind of legislative history of the TVPA. And I think it's really important, again, before we talk about what's happening today in child labor trafficking cases, to understand this. But this is a case that involved an employer who ran a large chicken farm in the East Coast, who recruited and brought in a Mexican family and was exploiting their immigration status and financial dependency on his chicken farm. The children were also working for him in the fields on the farm with the parents. They weren't allowed to attend school. They weren't allowed to leave. Again, the question was, is this involuntary? The threats of removing their immigration status and being sent back to their home country. And in this particular case, the court ruled that involuntary servitude, again, what is involuntary versus voluntary? The court ruled that involuntary servitude requires more than just psychological pressure or poor working conditions. And so it narrowed the interpretation of involuntary servitude under the 13th Amendment and its related statutes. And that legal coercion or physical force, not just emotional or economic pressure, which was a big part of this case, a component, was required to prove involuntary servitude. Fast forward again, another, if I'm doing my math right, 20 years, and there are other cases too. I'm providing some highlights. And in this particular case, US v. Lewis, federal prosecutors charged William Lewis and several others who were leaders of a religious cult and commune that started in Chicago and moved to Western Michigan that was called the House of Judah, with holding children in involuntary servitude. So again, the question here is, what is involuntary as part of the involuntary servitude statute? This commune operated in a rural part of Western Michigan and maintained very strict control over its members, especially the children. The victims in this case were minors who were brought into the commune. They were forced to perform physical labor, including field work and chores, under threat of physical punishment and religious-based psychological coercion. Evidence showed that the children were subject to routine beatings for disobedience. Their freedom of movement, education, association was severely restricted. Just as important, however, that in terms of facts of the case that was used to kind of determine, is this voluntary, involuntary, the children's parents were also compromised. The parents and the teacher of the school they were forced to endure beatings and torture in front of the children to demonstrate kind of the dominance and leadership of the cult leaders. And in this particular case, in terms of determining, is this actually involuntary servitude of the children, the court considered whether the children were held against their will by means of force, threat, or coercion under the involuntary servitude statute, but that they were especially vulnerable to coercion because they were isolated from outside influences and that all the adults in their circle were compromised, and that conditioned them to being more vulnerable to coercion and involuntary servitude. And that in this particular case, it also recognized that it's not solely based on physical force or physical restraint, because children's understanding of their autonomy and freedom was still developing. And that the use of like just fear of beatings, fear of corporal punishment, fear of seeing their teacher and their parents being dominated and abused was considered involuntary. And so this is a case that's notable in that it's also a case that demonstrates an understanding of, again, the developmental distinctions that many of you addressed just a few minutes ago in this presentation as it relates to how do we apply this legalistic term to kids as distinct to adults. And it also exposed loopholes, again, in that failed to account for these non-physical coercion, particularly involving psychological manipulation of kids. And again, the recognition that they are developmentally different than adults. Fast forwards, this may be a familiar case for those of you who've been working in the field for a long time. Another case that occurred in Western Michigan on a farm. This is a family, it's a landmark Supreme Court case that defined the boundaries of involuntary servitude under the 13th Amendment. So I've just done a really fast track of historical cases that demonstrate that courts were interpreting the involuntary statute differently and using different forms of analysis. Some say you need physical force. Other cases say, nope, psychological coercion is enough. Some are using, understanding distinctions between children and adults in their analysis. Others are not. In this particular case, it involves two men with intellectual disabilities. So they were forced to work on a dairy farm over a decade under extremely exploitative conditions. The Kosminski family used not only physical coercion, but also psychological coercion, including isolation, threats of reinstitutionalizing the men to keep them working without pay. And ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled that involuntary servitude under federal law required evidence of coercion through physical force or threats of physical force or legal harm, that psychological coercion alone without evidence of physical force was not enough under the statute at this time. And so this Supreme Court case narrowed the definition of involuntary servitude, excluding psychological coercion. But the holding left up to Congress to enact a new law to be more inclusive of the different means used to compel and coerce labor. In this particular case, if you read the documents, the court was very much aware and acknowledged the severity of the case and how terribly treated the victims were, both psychologically and physically. But again, their holding was that involuntary servitude was to be interpreted much more narrowly, with that required some sort of physical coercion. But then the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed by Congress, which included a wider range of means to compel service or labor, and included new criminal statutes of forced labor or trafficking with respect to peonage slavery and voluntary servitude or forced labor. There's a lot of terms on the slide. I'm sure many of you are familiar with all of them, but the takeaway here is that it essentially directly responded to the Kosminski said and say, okay, well, we know involuntary servitude, now we have legal precedent that it requires a narrower interpretation, but we know that people are being exploited and compelled and in slavery-like conditions via a wider range of means. So that is what the TVPA set out to do. Many of you have seen this slide or a version of this slide where we go into the different kind of simplifying all the elements of this previous slide, which has a lot of language here, but we're going to do a little more of a deep dive into there, like where, and also the distinction here for children, where for children, the recognition is that children cannot consent to a commercial sex act. So there is no requirement of a proof of any particular means, such as force, fraud, or coercion. But for labor trafficking, that requirement still exists. And this is where we get into some of the kind of tricky areas of identifying child labor trafficking versus other types of labor exploitation or child labor violations or other maltreatment or forms of abuse. And it's important to even drill down a little bit more into the definition, right, of coercion. So the definition of coercion, I think, is perhaps one of the most important terms when we're looking at child trafficking, and it's a legal concept for investigating and charging human trafficking. So it's any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause a person to believe that failure to perform an act would result in serious harm to or physical restraint against any person. So it doesn't actually have to result in physical harm, but just a threat that this may result in harm not to them, not only to them, but against any person. It could be their parents or could be their siblings or other people who are part of the trafficking scheme. Additionally, serious harm is defined as any harm, whether physical or non-physical, that includes, again, psychological, financial, reputational harm. So again, more than just physical harm. And so the purpose of my kind of drilling down and emphasizing these legal terms that are part of the statutory definition of trafficking is, what does this mean for children versus adults? How do we interpret coercion and serious harm with respect to children? And so while state statutes might differ, the key to human trafficking cases is often the ability to articulate the victim's background, their vulnerabilities, their state of mind, their developmental state, again, compared to the perpetrator's tactics of coercion and control, and taking into account all of the surrounding circumstances that could potentially affect the victim's beliefs of what would or could happen if they did not comply with the trafficker's requests or demands. So I want you to hold on to this thought as it relates to our earlier exercise of what are the differences between children and adults. It's very important. Okay, so I'm going to just provide a few case examples, and I like to start with, and this is not all inclusive, but just the purpose of this is to just show the diversity of different types of labor trafficking cases. And I start with a couple that have been prosecuted, and I'll share a couple more in criminal legal proceedings. And I start with these because this is the highest burden, right? This is the highest burden of proof. And so often my hope is that you see some of these fact patterns and say, okay, this actually exists in my jurisdiction or my community. And knowing that this was effectively prosecuted as a labor trafficking case that involved children can perhaps assist you in analyzing and identifying potential cases in your own practices. So the first case in Kentucky, the traffickers were the mother of the victims were the mother of the victims as well as her boyfriend. The traffickers forced the children to peddle goods and walk door to door and had a quota of how much they had to sell. And if they didn't sell enough, they were subject to both physical and psychological abuse. So this would certainly count under involuntary servitude, as well as trafficking statutes. Another couple from Ohio that use extreme both physical and psychological abuse to traffic a disabled woman and her daughter for domestic work and including forced criminality and obtaining drugs. This is a case out of Florida in 2010, 2011, where there were over 20 children and young adults who were promised honest wages through this Job Corps program. And I don't know if it's easy for you to see the screen or read it, but this is a van that says Teens Against Drugs and Alcohol. So this was a program that was kind of touted as a workforce development program. Instead, the children were crammed in the back, and these were kids who were in the community, but also some were wards of the state, and recruited to participate in a program that was supposed to teach them work skills. Instead, they were crammed in the back of this van, driven around and forced to sell cheap items and candy bars door to door and outside of gas stations in the suburbs of Orlando in the summer. They worked for 10-hour days. They were transported in incredibly unsafe conditions to unfamiliar neighborhoods. Their food and water was rationed. You think about Orlando in the middle of the summer. And then police ultimately arrested the men in connection with this operation on labor trafficking charges. This was a case that involved unaccompanied minors from Guatemala who were offered promises of an education and a better life in the United States. The traffickers had obtained deeds from property from the victims' families to secure their smuggling debts. They were smuggled into the United States. The traffickers represented themselves as the unaccompanied minor sponsors, and then the children were released into their custody. And the traffickers claimed to be family friends, and instead they were held in slavery, as you can see from the headline, slave-like labor rings on Ohio egg farms. I also just want to pause here to encourage you all to think about also like the types of cases and what type of case is occurring in terms of what is this specific labor, whether it's agricultural, whether it's peddling, whether it's domestic servitude, and also who the perpetrators are. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when it comes to the study that we enacted, but you can see hopefully a diversity of all of the above. Interestingly, with this case, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, when we initiated our research project, we spoke to some of the advocates who were working with the minors involved in this case, and one of them had actually received some information about knowing your rights and kind of red flags for exploitation and labor trafficking while they were in federal custody, and that raised red flags when he was initially released to Ohio, and he left. And unfortunately, it was subsequently exploited under different conditions. But it also says something about the power of information, particularly for youth. And I'll come back to that when we get to implications for practice. Skip this one, but I'll talk a little bit more about this in the research study where, like the U.S. v. Lewis cases, cult leaders may use, not all, but may use spiritual coercion to compel and coerce individuals, including children, into compulsory labor or services for their own financial benefit. This is a case that occurred in Utah about 10 years ago. Victor Rax, who's a Guatemalan national residing in Salt Lake City, orchestrated a trafficking ring that primarily targeted undocumented boys aged 9 to 5. And there were some documented as well. And he really exploited their vulnerabilities: poverty, immigration status, lack of familial support, or lack of financial or economic support. Some of these boys actually had families, and he presented himself as a trustworthy figure, often referred to as an uncle within the community. He groomed these young boys and men with gifts, food, drugs, and then subsequently subjecting them to sexual abuse and coercing them into drug trafficking and drug distribution activities. And I think if you read the details of this case, the grooming is very similar to what we see in many sex trafficking cases as well. And so this is a case that demonstrates another type of trafficking, which is forced criminality, where victims are compelled to engage in illegal activities under duress. And so after grooming and abusing the boys, he forced them to sell drugs, leveraging threats of harm, exposure, shame in terms of sharing what had occurred between himself and the boys, and also deportation in some of the cases where for youth who were a vulnerable immigration status, to ensure that they were compliant with Victor Rax. And so this psychological manipulation not only facilitated his criminal enterprise, where he was financially benefiting from the forced criminality and the drug smuggling, but also instilled fear that prevented the boys from seeking help. And this had been going on for a very long time. Okay, so we know that labor trafficking, hopefully from these cases, varies dramatically. And I specifically focused on providing case examples that might be kind of outside of the kind of typical or traditional norms. Like, for example, when I was practicing, a lot of my cases were domestic servitude cases, also factory work, restaurant work, agriculture, you name it, it happened. Care work was often a big one for both adults and children. So we know that it varies dramatically from compelled or coerced labor that includes physical and or psychological coercion in legitimate labor sectors, but also includes illegitimate labor sectors such as forced criminality. And so I want to ask right now, why are child labor trafficking cases challenging to identify? I've kind of given you some of the answers already, but I hope that you can comment in the chat in terms of why do you think that, based on what we know, and we're 25 years into the TVPA, why are children who are survivors of labor trafficking still the most under-identified cohort of victims in the trafficking field? And if someone can
Fear of
help kind
speaking up. I'll try to capture these for you.
of,
I see fear of speaking up. Anybody else?
they don't want to speak up. I mean, some of these will overlap
Feeling of
with trafficking. Mhm.
feelings of hopelessness, hard to identify.
Mhm.
Don't often self-identify as victims. Too young to understand that they're even being trafficked. Oh, here, there's a whole bunch more. Immigration, afraid of law enforcement. What happened to them has been normalized.
Yes.
They can't hire attorneys and they have no access to advocate. The overlap between, you mentioned the sex and labor trafficking. Law and policy is not directly clear on what is considered trafficking. Few resources and avenues for reporting when isolated.
Yes, yes, yes. Check to all of those.
Mm.
And I think especially resources, I want to go back to even access to an attorney or an advocate. And again, a lot of these overlap with sex trafficking. And one of the things I haven't articulated, but I think is important, is that often sex and labor trafficking can occur together, right? And sometimes it's just one or the other, but there's no hierarchy in the type of victimhood. But sometimes, again, children unfortunately experience both. And so these are all really important in terms of kids normalizing the activity, especially if they start out young, they may not know better. And I think one of the comments was also about lack of kind of clarity in terms of what is actual child labor trafficking, right? And if we go back to, and this is actually a beautiful segue into, let's bring back the laws again. How does the law help, hinder? What should we be looking at specifically when it comes to identification? I've given you a little bit of a preview of this when I talked about the history kind of preceding our trafficking law, but the centering it in our current anti-trafficking laws come from this involuntary servitude and slavery. And so when we talk about involuntary servitude, what is voluntary, what is involuntary, it comes back into play when we talk about labor trafficking and specifically child trafficking. So I'm going to flash this up there. Lots of words, lots of different statutory elements, but again, to drill down, like, what is a serious harm or threat of serious harm? What does that mean for a child versus an adult? What is a scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause a person to believe that if they did not perform the labor services, that another person would suffer serious harm or restraint? How are these legal statutory elements being applied subjectively and in the context and also developmentally of a child versus an adult. And so this is one of the issues when it comes to the barriers in identifying, one of the challenges in identifying these cases, right? It's the force, fraud, or coercion. And how does that play out for children versus adults? Children, as you all mentioned in the first exercise, are developmentally different, psychologically different, and their agency changes as they grow older. But their vulnerability is also, they're wholly dependent on adults for their survival. And so I'll talk about this later when I talk about our research study, but often when we were talking to case managers, even survivors, and we said, okay, what was the force? What was the fraud? What was the coercion? Not in that, we didn't ask them that way, but often it was like, this adult told me to do this. And I didn't know what else to do. I didn't feel like I had any other options because there's no other option to be economically independent, psychologically independent. I had nowhere else to go. And so when I talk about the law, I also just want to acknowledge that there are different legal systems that serves a different purpose in responding to children who have been trafficked for sex or for labor. And this accords survivors different rights. And I don't have time to go into all of these. These could each be a distinct webinar, but I do want to acknowledge that, and this comes up in our research study, that children have rights and protections, those who are trafficked for labor, trafficked for sex, and even exploited for labor, not just trafficked. And I'll talk about the distinctions in just a few minutes in these different systems. And so, for example, in our civil legal system, actually there's a few civil systems, but for labor law enforcement, there are different laws that are applicable. So there are different legal remedies for child labor trafficking that don't just fall under the criminal legal system. I also want to briefly touch on international law and policy. I teach international human rights at Loyola School of Law, and I often start with, people often think we don't care about international human rights law or international law, but the US is still a signatory and has ratified many of these legal treaties and documents and conventions. So I want to elevate these for you all in your advocacy, and also in terms of how we apply our own domestic laws. So, for example, the Palermo Protocol, which is our international anti-trafficking law that defines the crime of trafficking internationally from a criminal perspective, does not require the proof of force, fraud, or coercion for children for labor trafficking. The ILO defines worst form of child labor trafficking, the use, procuring, or offering of a child for illicit activities, which would include, forced criminality, as a type of trafficking. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which the US is not a party to, but also includes, but has signed, but it did not ratify, that also addresses labor trafficking, sex trafficking. And then while the US has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the US has ratified an international human rights instrument called the Optional Protocol on the Sale of Children, which includes sex trafficking, labor trafficking. What that means is we have obligations to report on our activities to make sure that we're protecting children, prosecuting perpetrators, similar to kind of the 3Ps under the TVPA. But also the Committee on the Rights of the Child issues what are called concluding recommendations that are, in fact, kind of soft law or policy that should inform how all areas of government, whether it's local, state, or federal, should be responding to these cases. And so it does provide guidance with respect to engagement in forced labor and forced trafficking. And so it's persuasive law, and the concluding recommendations, and we've been involved in a lot of this advocacy, are very clear about advocating that the US government and all stakeholders, including civil society, non-governmental organizations, judges, law enforcement, social works, use a child-centric or developmentally informed application to the analysis of these legal statutory definitions in determining whether something is child labor trafficking. And it also recommends that we also include forced criminality as a form of labor trafficking, and that is applicable to children as well as adults.
Professor Waltz, I just wanted to give you a halfway mark. You've got about 44 minutes remaining.
Great. I think I'm I'm actually, I think we're going to be good on time. And hopefully have a nice, robust conversation. And also, I just want to pause at this point. Thank you for the interruption, because I know it's really hard to sit and listen to someone talk, and I'm speaking very, very quickly. So I just want to share my appreciation and respect. And I probably have about maybe 15, 20 more minutes. And I'll try to go quickly as well so we can have a conversation. So I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that one of the things I want to talk about is, what does research tell us about children who've been trafficked in the United States for labor? And it should be obvious kind of why research is important, but I just even want to go back to kind of the early days in the human trafficking field and the anti-trafficking field, where almost all of the services, all of the trainings, kind of all of the language around trafficking, including my own experience, which I shared with you kind of as a new attorney in the field, was focused on sex trafficking and sex trafficking of foreign nationals. And then when research developed, we understood that the research showed, in particular, for not just for adults, but also for children, that it's not just girls, it's boys, it's LGBTQ, those who identify as LGBTQ plus, that there's a diversity in types of trafficking, diversity in types of pathways to trafficking. But there are some vulnerabilities and kind of risk factors that are shared. And that really, I think, changed the landscape a lot, because if we know that boys are being trafficked, if we know that children are being trafficked for labor, but all of the services are dedicated to one specific type of victim profile or type of trafficking, then we're not actually adequately responding to the issue. And again, I'm going to repeat myself. I don't want anyone to walk away from this presentation saying, Catherine Waltz said one type of trafficking is more important than the other. These are all incredibly important, and our human trafficking definitions come from involuntary servitude and slavery. All of this is compelled and coerced labor or services for the financial benefit of somebody else. So we are all in the same boat in terms of trying to do our best to do right by, in this particular case for this presentation, children who are being exploited. And so this is why I think research is really, really important. So we have more knowledge around what are the risk factors, what are the vulnerabilities, who are the exploiters, what are the experiences, what are the pathways, so we can do a better job of not just intervening after the fact, but also engaging in more productive and targeted prevention work. And so very pleased to share some top line highlights of a study that was a 3-year study, a national study on child labor trafficking with my colleagues at Northeastern, New York, NYU, and Loyola, interdisciplinary with criminologists, sociologists, legal scholars across the country. And the methods included, our research questions, let me start, as what is the nature of child labor trafficking in the United States? Who are the victims and what are their needs? We looked at both US citizen and also foreign national victims of child labor trafficking. How are the cases being identified? How are they being misidentified? Which is another way of asking the question of, like, what are the challenges in identifying and responding to these cases? Again, hopefully with the knowledge of that information can then help us inform better practices. And so we had 4 sites in California, Ohio, Illinois. Our desk research included looking at all of the prosecuted and non-prosecuted cases involving US citizens and non-US citizens that were available via public sources. We conducted stakeholder interviews with legal advocates, victim service providers, law enforcement agencies, local, state, and federal, as well as task forces, those who work directly with child labor trafficking survivors in each of the 4 sites. We also interviewed adult survivors of child labor trafficking. So these were individuals who are currently adults, but were previously identified as child labor trafficking victims through one of the different legal systems, which I mentioned earlier. And then, which made, I think, this a much more robust study because we had that input from survivors as well. And so we had consent forms detailing confidentiality and all, and it was an IRB We had an IRB with the study. And so without further ado, some highlights of the findings. Diverse profile that included both US citizen and foreign national cases. Not unlike the examples I just provided, a broad spectrum of industries, domestic work, legitimate industries as well as non-legitimate industries, both female and male victims. In terms of what were some of the risk factors that led to exploitation or trafficking, the lack of safe or affordable housing was consistently identified along with like economic needs or poverty. So there's some overlap here with sex trafficking situations. And then also legal vulnerability. And so those who are, for example, foreign nationals, where the threat of expulsion or deportation was used as a coercive tactic. Oops. In terms of perpetrator characteristics, again, diversity. And you can, even from the case examples that I provided, both historical and contemporary, we see, individuals, family members, some organized crime. But here, I think one of the outcomes was that there were a lot of family members as well. And they may not be immediate family members. It could be an aunt, an uncle, a step parent, a sponsor, and then the recruiters and or the exploiters were commonly known to the victim. The prevalence of labor trafficking victims who experienced exploitative labor practices was high, 97%. So this means before it even got to trafficking, there may have been a labor violation of not being paid enough, working too many hours, working in unsanitary or dangerous or hazardous conditions. And so there were on average also 16 domains of harm that were experienced by victims for each of the trafficking cases, which really underscores the complex nature of labor trafficking, in addition to the detrimental effects to their health and well-being. And then I think the other thing that our study showed is that most first responders who engage with children, and this includes helping agencies like child protection agencies, law enforcement, labor investigators, and including schools, are not identifying child labor trafficking cases. If there's some sort of formal mechanism to identify trafficking, it was focused on sex. So labor trafficking wasn't even part of an initial screening or intake. And then if it did include labor trafficking, they were often misidentified. And then the other piece, the outcome of this is that stakeholders are not applying a developmental analysis to the definition of trafficking in any of these kind of initial identification modalities, whether it's screening, whether it's intake, or other kind of protocols that are attempting to operationalize identifying child trafficking cases. And so, we know that children and adults can be vulnerable to trafficking at any age, but age, disability, immigration status, criminal justice history, housing insecurity, and more are make individuals more vulnerable. And that labor trafficking is still not clearly understood, which is, I think, one of the things that you all mentioned and kind of what makes it challenging, right? That it can be confusing, misidentified as another type of allegation of maltreatment, abuse, or exploitation. The definition itself is complicated, and there's not a lot of data being collected on this. And we've even seen in some of the agencies where there's a mandate to collect information on labor trafficking, but it's just not actually being implemented or enforced, right? So you can have all the laws and policies you want, but if they're not being implemented and monitored and evaluated for their efficacy, similar to going back to the historical, antecedents of trafficking, where we had so many laws that addressed the traffic of slaves, the movement of slaves, but weren't actually enforced, that allowed slavery to proliferate, then we're not actually doing much. And then the big overarching one is that stakeholders are not applying a developmentally informed analysis of coercion to determine if a child is trafficked or not. And they assume a child's capacity to assess risk is the same as adults. Only a minority of cases, 15%, were identified by law enforcement. And almost half of the victims demonstrated remarkable resilience in escaping victimization and seeking help independently, and often multiple places. There was one case I remember I spoke to the survivor where she talked to her teacher, she talked to a neighbor, she talked to a counselor at the school. At one point, she was in a health clinic, and nobody, either they didn't believe her or they mischaracterized this as like a domestic dispute versus a trafficking issue. It was a family problem. It was a private problem. Again, it's kind of, for those of you who worked in domestic violence, this may sound familiar. And I think one of the themes of that is you don't find what you're not looking for, right? So if you're not screening for it, if you're not operationalizing some sort of identification protocol or process for identifying child trafficking, you're not going to find it. And we heard that all the time in this research project, particularly agencies who say, you know, we don't see child labor trafficking. Well, what's your mechanism for actually screening and identifying? Well, we don't actually have it. Well, then you're not actually going to have data on trafficking. Or if they do, there were some places that didn't actually implement training on how to actually, you know, identify traffic. Their trafficking training, child trafficking training, was just focused on sex trafficking, with no context or information for labor trafficking, right? So then, of course, you're not going to identify those cases. So very quickly, some preliminary implications for practice. And so some of this may sound familiar. I've been talking about this. You know, the need for more screening. So our study showed that most first responders who engage with children, including child serving systems like schools and child protection, labor, are not identifying these cases and are often misidentifying them as something else. Again, needing to collaborate with a broader range of stakeholders, including the labor sector, where they may have eyes and ears in different labor sectors, including some of these legitimate labor sectors like agriculture, factories, restaurant work, particularly since there are a number of states now that are rolling back their child labor laws and allowing for children to engage in work at younger ages, longer hours, and in more hazardous types of industries. The need to collaborate with child system actors, child protection, public guardians, juvenile justice, probation, again, making sure that all of these places where I think there's been so much progress on sex trafficking, and there's always more to be done, but that the labor trafficking piece also catches up to that. And then also this piece on, and I'm a broken record, but needing to follow the congressional intent of the TVPA, again, which was trying to distinguish from the Supreme Court holding around the limitations of what is involuntary to physical force, but to non-physical force, and also to apply a subjective analysis in terms of what is the time, place of that specific person. And in this case, when we're talking about kids, applying a child-centric, developmentally oriented analysis of those terms. And we can certainly do a separate training even just on that with some case studies. And then the other implications for practice, and this goes into interventions, is most youth, and particularly in our study, and I've seen this in other reports, and those who are older want to work. And work is a good thing. I don't want, again, anyone to walk away from this saying that, Professor Walt said kids shouldn't be working. I think for older adolescents, and we know this, it's an important life skill. There's a lot of good things that come from safe and monitored work activities. So we need to explore and provide more opportunities to expand vocational programs and employment skills, and also knowing your rights about being an employee as a youth, to prevent different types of labor exploitation and trafficking. So kids are safe and lawful employment opportunities, engage in lawful employment opportunities. Sometimes I start with this slide, and I feel like I probably should have, so that's my confession to you, but I think there's no bad place for it. But it should be obvious, but the reason that this is kind of like, why do we care, right? Like why do we need to be better? All of us, including myself, as a community. of individuals who care about children and care about this issue, what is the impact of child labor trafficking? And so it affects, going back to again the earlier exercise, it affects their bodies and their brains and their development, like these long working days, the use of toxic chemicals, insufficient adequate food and accommodations, like that case out of Florida that I talked about, the being you know being engaged in physical, sexual, verbal violence and exploitation is a violation of their rights as and their humanity, and it all causes harm, psychological harm, physical harm, and harm to their well-being and their development. So, kind of as a kind of a centering statement or slide, I wanted to include this in terms of why it's important that we address this. Some of the questions that come often to me during these types of presentations is what can I do? Or what are the resources that are out there? So I have some lists of resources that are currently published by Department of Health and Human Services, the Office of Trafficking and Persons Unit. Foreign national minors also have eligibility for humanitarian assistance for those who are identified. There is a great document that includes kind of a table of all the different screening tools that are used across different organizations and kind of what they screen for, maybe what the pros and cons are. And so without knowing more about what your respective needs are, I just wanted to provide that to you to look at, to consider if you don't actually have like an operationalized protocol to identify child labor trafficking in your respective workplace. And then I just wanted to conclude here before we get into questions. And I went super, super fast, but I want to ask you now, what do you think action steps that you'll take to apply knowledge and information that you have gleaned from this webinar and perhaps from other sources on child labor trafficking? My disclaimer is this was initially an anonymous QR code mentee exercise. I don't want to put anyone on the spot in terms of like sharing out what you plan to do, but I hope that you respond to this question, to this prompt, and share some information about what you want, what you think you can do differently, or what you want to know more about, perhaps. And then
So,
Mhm.
go ahead.
No, and I just want to put my email up here, and while folks are thinking about that question and submitting that to the chat.
So would you like me to read these back to you as they come in, or can you see them?
I can see them now. I'm going to stop sharing because I think people are tired of looking at my PowerPoint. Um,
Good. So I'll turn that back over to you.
Great. Okay. So yeah, so I see questions. So more careful screening, right? Share this with state courts and domestic violence. I'm going to put my email in the chat as well. Right. So just, sharing information about how important it is to screen. And then I think I love that, share with my bench or research. And there are other studies on which I'm happy to share, and I've shared some of the links to our organizers. So thank you, Leslie, for additional resources. But just having a better understanding of the fact that this exists. This has been existing, unfortunately, for a long time. But we have a new legal paradigm and tool with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and our state statutes, but it often gets complicated with how it's interpreted. So I'm really hoping that you've all walk away from this presentation with a better understanding of not just what it is, but how to train your colleagues and how to identify and how to advocate for these cases, right? Oh, I love this, collaborating with police bureau who have not been referring these cases to your child advocacy centers. I was actually very privileged to bring our first child labor trafficking case to our own local child advocacy center, who had previously only worked with victims of sexual abuse and exploitation. And so that's another, area where it's not a one size fits all, where these multidisciplinary centers that have a lot of experience in working with children who are victims of crime may also need additional training and some even potentially even resources to better accommodate child labor trafficking cases.
And let me just say that there's a couple of tools we've developed. We just expanded our screening tool for Violence Against Women Act and U visa cases to better identify co-occurring labor trafficking and sex trafficking within families that is occurring with domestic violence or child abuse or sexual assault. So we have that tool available that we can put on the website. And the other thing I would encourage people to do is it's really important to identify, if you suspect you've identified a foreign-born victim of human trafficking, making a referral to OTIP could be very important for that child to get services and support. And we have whole webinars that we've done with HHS OTIP that we can make sure you're linked to for those of you who are participating that talk about. That's a whole other process, but it's a series of supports that can be helpful to child trafficking victims as well.
It's also federally required. So there's a federal
Right.
requirement that any enforcement agency, and that is interpreted broadly, who comes into contact with a potential suspected child trafficking victim, recognizing the additional vulnerabilities that those who are undocumented have, are required to call the office, to call OTIP and get in touch with them about services. So you're not reporting the crime necessarily, but you are getting them in touch with federal agency that's tasked with providing humanitarian assistance in the interim.
And what's really great about that came up in our conversation with OTIP and judges is for the judges and court staff and everybody on this call to know that if they identify a child as a victim of human trafficking, they'll assign supports and a federal social worker. And so it really does help get more support for that child. And as a judge, it gives you more options of what you can do to help.
Mhm.
So, and somebody asked about the time zone and the startup. We will make this recording available. So for those of you that came in late, you'll be able to catch up. And Catherine, do you want to go back and look at some of the, let me see here.
I'm putting my email in the chat. I see a question from Samantha.
Do you want to take that or?
Sure. And then I also see an anonymous question. So,
Okay. Oh, coming in the Q&A, sorry.
okay, yeah. People I think are raising their hands, but I need to see them in the Q&A because I can't see folks. So for since COVID, we have seen a greater proliferation of homeschooling programs, which make it more difficult to actually see eyes on children regularly. We suspect many of these children are being homeschooled in order to provide childcare for younger children. Do you have suggestions for confronting the situation or recommendations for resources where I can do further research? That's a good question. I don't have, I don't have specific knowledge on like the homeschooling community. It's my understanding that there are some parameters around that where there's some, reporting requirements, and the a local school district and community do need information about who's being homeschooled versus who's attending school in a community. So there may be opportunities to engage the school district to make sure that there's some more check-ins, right? And this is a question that actually demonstrates the trickiness in some of these gray areas where even if older kids are watching younger ones, does that rise to a level of trafficking? And so that requires more inquiry and more fact finding. And then here's a question: is anyone using screening tools link with the West Coast group for potential labor trafficking when their state's juvenile offices? I think so. I can't provide any specific responses, but there may be some of your colleagues on this call who are. The one thing I will say about the screening tools is that they're not. The tough part with labor trafficking is they're not quick. They require training on how to actually screen, and they require a more kind of sophisticated knowledge around how to identify child labor trafficking. So that makes it inherently more challenging, right? Especially if you're at an agency with a lot of turnover or you don't have a lot of time. So just something to think about.
So Catherine, another question
Mhm.
related to that has to do with if you're a judge and sometimes you don't see the whole picture at the first point in time, at the first juncture. or the first time the child has contact with the court system. What are some of the things, the kinds of findings that a judge might make that would essentially begin to create a record where somebody could then, a further judge down the road might like identify something else and begin to put the puzzle together? Are there things that you'd recommend that state court judges can do, whether or not they have a fully developed, they can see the whole picture, but what are some of the things that, are useful to document to help build the case, I guess you could say?
I think, I mean, first and foremost is just asking questions, right, around the conditions of work and labor and all the great knowledge and understanding that that I know that many of the judges who have already been who are invested in trafficking generally, right, and know when you're working with sex trafficking victims and what we started with that children may not be disclosing. It's like the style, like the tactics of how to ask questions where they're not um, where they're neutral. So if we know that many of the perpetrators or recruiters are family members, it doesn't make sense to ask questions about the trafficker, right, or the exploiter. But it makes sense to ask questions about, like, when were you in school? How long were you working at this job? What were the hours? What were the conditions, right? Because even later you can go back and potentially even file a civil suit where there's a record of like the hours working, where you can go back and for restitution purposes or some sort of civil damages as well. So I think it's just really the adding this other layer. And I know everyone's so overwhelmed and overworked, and there's already so many things you're looking for, but adding this other layer of inquiry that is inclusive of child labor trafficking, and then making sure that those elements that are part of the statute are explored. Right? What was this? What were some of the psychological pieces? What were some of the financial aspects? What were the rules? What is the day to day? Beyond that, I don't have any specific case examples of that, unfortunately. But that's a really good research project. So hopefully we'll do that one day.
Somebody asked a question about having further training on forensic interviewing children of child trafficking victims. Any recommendations about that?
So my understanding is that a lot of the forensic training comes from law enforcement. So, like federal agencies usually have forensic trainers, child advocacy centers, also the non-law enforcement folks, engaged in forensic training. I think, in terms of forensic training on child labor trafficking, I don't have a specific like resource. I do a separate, training on identifying cases. So I'm not a forensic interviewer, but I apply a lot of the same techniques. So I'm happy to part two this and kind of get into some of the details and how to tease out some of the, again, what is coercion? What is threat of harm or serious harm, and examples of how that plays out from a developmental perspective. And then I compare that to cases that have been adjudicated. Um, Again, to try to kind of amplify some of the tactics that are used.
Mhm.
And again, we are still in this, even though we're 20 years into the TVPA, labor trafficking is still something that is widely misunderstood and misinterpreted. So you are all kind of on the front lines in this movement to try to elevate and amplify responses and practices like this, good interviewing skills, training, screening, operationalizing, right? Which is somewhat ironic considering that this is one of the oldest crimes on the books, which hopefully is another takeaway from this presentation, right? But it all goes back to what is involuntary? Who gets to decide, right? What are the normative values around that? What is coercion? Who gets to decide? And how are we thinking about this from a developmental standpoint? So I think partnering also with child development experts, adolescent development experts, child trauma experts is also a key recommendation.
That'd be great. Another thing that we can share that might be useful is we just finished a training manual for child protective services workers on identifying on the role they can play with regard to particularly foreign-born children who come in contact with their system, and the roles that they can play in terms of getting them certifications or getting them referrals and understanding like who's eligible for which forms of immigration relief based on labor trafficking, for example. And so we can share that with as part of the resources as well.
That's really key because I think for a lot, particularly for child protection agencies, are often, overwhelmed and working on nominal resources. And so it's like, okay, what do I do with this population? That's always the question. I mean, it's always the question. So then what? We identify someone and then what? And there are a lot of resources that are out there. So what you're describing, Leslie, is incredibly, incredibly helpful. And it is a different response. And I just want to acknowledge that. I know it may be controversial, but the vulnerabilities and the legal complications of undocumented children require another level of intervention. And so there are lots of different resources and experts out there. And if we're all, again, in the same boat of protecting all kids, if we're here for children, regardless of their nationality, immigration status, race, gender, all those things, then we need to, that's part of our mandate, right? To understand how those services may be distinct. Similarly to LGBTQ youth or other sex trafficking populations.
So there's another point in the
Actually,
chat.
this question here is really good. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Leslie.
No,
Challenging
we're
is
in the
whether may
same
be
place.
confirmed as labor trafficking victims by the state. The Department of Labor still needs to verify their status. I'm curious what that means because I've actually never had a case where the Department of Labor needs to verify their status.
Yeah, I wouldn't think. And what's interesting is if, if you think they're confirmed as labor trafficking victims, then they should be being referred to OTIP. And,
Yeah.
if they're foreign born, and then
Mhm.
they do an independent, their own investigation so that you don't need that
Yeah.
kind of information.
So there's two maybe layers to this question if I'm understanding it correctly. One is you don't, this is true for all trafficking cases, all whether it's sex trafficking or labor trafficking. The law and the regulations are clear on this. You don't need to have an effective prosecution or open investigation to receive protections, right? They're parallel paths. Like you can investigate a case, like labor can investigate it, the criminal legal system can investigate it, but the access to protections is independent of whether this part here is successful. And for minors, there are the law is explicitly states for undocumented minors, for example, that they're not required to cooperate with law enforcement. Now, I know in practice sometimes that is interpreted differently, or the local practices may be differently. But that's where, again, reaching out to experts, folks in OTEP, folks like Leslie, feel free to contact me, other folks to help you kind of navigate those situations. And often it's like well-intentioned, but just not necessarily, in line with the actual legal requirements. So often it's an issue of training and technical assistance.
There's a really good question about prosecutors. So sometimes prosecutors and victim advocates can sometimes uncover labor trafficking during misdemeanor child abuse prosecutions investigations when
Mm-hmm.
CPS investigations have missed it. What measures can prosecutors introduce to increase the likelihood of uncovering labor trafficking?
I think everything that you are all recommending. Um, and I think to go back in the observation of kind of one arm of enforcement or an agency isn't necessarily in line with another. That's consistent across all forms of trafficking. One of the things that came out of our study is that child protection agencies are largely not looking for these cases or identifying them. Even those states that have it as part of their labor trafficking, as part of their child abuse neglect act on a local level, aren't necessarily operationalizing that. So I think if you're part of a task force, zeroing in on that as an action step and then making sure that there's professional development and protocols that can help operationalize the communication between those agencies. But again, it's controversial. Like, does child protection agency need to refer these cases to law enforcement? And I think different states and different jurisdictions are approaching that differently. I don't have a one size fits all for that.
Is there, in terms of, have you identified, so for example, let's say you have a prosecutor who believes that this, they're working with a victim, they believe it may be trafficking, they uncover it. Where would you recommend they refer someone? Like which are there victim services agency, victim advocacy agencies? Should they call us? We call you. I mean, like if somebody
Right,
wants to
right.
try to connect a child, what are
Um,
your recommendations?
So, I would look at who is funded to provide services. And again, it depends. So some organizations are funded to provide services to foreign national and US citizens. Some are, you have to learn, and this is if you're part of a task force or coalition, you may already have this information at your hand, but know again, what is the capacity and the eligibility criteria of your partner organizations first. If you don't know that, you can always call OVC, OVW, HHS and find out like who's funded to
Mhm,
do this work. Another tactic, you can also call your local task force or coalition and pose a hypothetical question without disclosing any identifying information about. So, who works with these kids? What's the eligibility criteria? What are their practices and protocols? Right. And so there's, and I know that the trafficking hotline also refers people to service providers as well. But
mhm,
I would, if you're already doing this work, I would just reach out to your local partners and find out in advance of identifying a case, who's got funding to do this work with
mhm.
these different populations. And sometimes
So
even
there's,
if they don't have specific trafficking funding, there's a mandate to do that, right? Like child
right.
protection, right? Or schools, right? They're and mandatory reporters and all those things. The one thing I would say is just, always thinking about do no harm, like know your community, know your jurisdiction, know that, like, particularly if you're working with a vulnerable population, right? What potential consequences or unintended consequences are of reporting to different stakeholders. And again, that will vary community to community.
There's
Um,
another question in the chat that I think is important to address, which can you talk more about minors and not requiring cooperation?
mhm.
Can you explain more about what that is?
Sure. I think when I said that, I was referring specifically to part of our federal immigration law that explicitly states for non-US citizens, for children, for anyone who's a minor, they're not required to prove reasonable cooperation in the investigation of or prosecution of a trafficking case, unlike adults, to receive immigration benefits. That includes a T visa. So that is what the law states. Now, they may still be engaged, in an open investigation or prosecution. They may have tried to report, or their advocate may have tried to report that, but it is not a requirement. So you can submit an application for immigration relief without a certificate that proves, and that is explicit in the law with the recognition that engagement with criminal legal system and law enforcement can often be traumatizing or re-traumatizing, right? That doesn't exist for US citizens because there's no companion kind of immigration benefit. But then I'll just go back to the larger piece of you can receive protections and services. And one of those links that was in my presentation is a nice chart of, like, on a federal level, and they may vary on a state level, like what are the different services and benefits available to US citizens, non-US citizens, right, as a victim of trafficking. There's nothing that states that, again, that there has to be a companion investigation or prosecution. And that's another thing to be mindful of, is that sometimes this is tricky because there may not be an interest in participating in an investigation or prosecution. But the criminal legal system or another civil legal system is. And so it's a tender balance of protecting the children's rights and pursuing these cases. And so that's almost a separate presentation as well, in terms of understanding kind of what some of those parameters are under victim witness guidelines, the rights of children, access to counsel and advocates to represent children in criminal legal proceedings as victim witnesses, right? That's a separate process from receiving protections from service providers. It gets tricky.
And it's interesting because there's a comment that talks about like the prosecutor's office, victim advocates not being able to name the trafficking, but getting somebody to another agency that doesn't, so that the child is getting victim advocacy support can help the child be identified and can help connect them. Can you talk about, is there any, a little bit more about that potentially?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last part of that? Because I was looking
So
up the statute for not required as cooperation
yeah, I
with
think what
visa.
they're talking about is the prosecutor's office, like victim advocates themselves, not being able to say, well, you're a trafficking victim, right? Because then they'd be kind of putting words in the kid's mouth. But they can, if you connect them, if you suspect they're a victim of human trafficking, you can connect them with a victim advocacy program that can then do the fuller analysis so that,
Absolutely.
you know,
Yeah, and I think that's a no, that's a really good practice too. I mean, it's no different than sex trafficking or really a lot of situations of victimization, right? If I tell anyone on this call, you're a victim of X, right? Your initial response is that like is will often be defensive and particularly for kids, as many of you said, who may be normalizing these experiences who where it may involve again acquaintance, a family member, someone they know, like that's not going to be their starting place. So I think um, one of the things that I will say is, these are things that have happened to you, right? And versus you are a victim of. And so because these things happen to you, I would encourage you to explore what some of your options are, right? And some choices that you can make about how you want to like proceed with getting some, assistance or even information. And I think again, especially I think for older kids, that agency in that process is helpful. So however you're kind of couching this and however you're asking that child to consider their options, positioning it that way is often more effective. Oh, thank you for responding to the e-visa.
yeah, you're welcome. Um, So we have 2 minutes
Mhm.
remaining. Are there any kind of concluding remarks or, points you want to make for the group or actually, yeah, or is there, um,
Yeah.
we
I mean,
miss
I'll
anything?
start with, well, first, thank you. I mean, listening to someone for an hour and a half, especially these days with our diminished attention spans and bandwidths, is often challenging. So I appreciate you sticking with us and participating in this. I think I start a little untraditionally by going through history, which might make some people start snoring at the beginning of the presentation, but I do it intentionally because I think it's really important to situate these cases in our history of involuntary servitude and compelled and coerced labor. And recognizing that we have these tools under our new laws that are not perfect. We keep creating laws that address the same thing, right? Compelled and coerced labor. And they're not perfect because I think of institutional biases or kind of systemic challenges, right? And so, historically, we may not have seen a situation where someone who was a child of color or an immigrant child as a victim of a certain type of crime because of our own biases, right? So I think just being really intentional about recognizing that and going back to what is the policy intention of this? It's to make sure that we are meeting people where they're at. This is the victim-centered approach. And here's a very, very tactical a way of doing that is we need to approach our analysis of these cases more subjectively and from a kid's perspective, from a developmental perspective. Like I think the how we think about coercion is kind of what the almost 200 years of what is involuntary following the creation of involuntary servitude statute, and that's where we are right now. And you are all on the front lines to help do that. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and I want to thank you so much, Catherine, for the presentation. It was super helpful and enlightening. And I would just encourage the judges on the call to, make findings about what you're seeing, because that can create a record, whether it's now or in the future, that build these cases. And that's true of everyone. Document what you're seeing so
Oh,
I think she's frozen.
Okay, while she's frozen, I just want to also say I'll extend that to document what you're seeing and also just for everyone to walk away with. This happens more often than we think. And it's been happening a long time. And most of these cases are not being identified in this way. So if we can use all of our kind of respective superpowers to try to amplify efforts to be better at identifying, responding, preventing, we will all live in a much better world. So thank you so much. And I think you will, yes, you will get a copy of the PowerPoint with all the sources as well as some additional resources.